everyone, and welcome to Step Into My Office, Commercial Property Executives podcast series that discusses all things office and flex office related. Join me and industry experts in the field as we take some trips across major markets and delve into investment strategies and opportunities when it comes to office. I'm Olivia Bunescu, Associate Editor, and for this episode, CBRE's Global Head of Occupier Research, Julie Whelan, is joining me to offer some insights on the main challenges for the office sector and some of the promising trends that make flex office more attractive to operators and tenants. Julie, a specialist in the future of work, is focused on how the core transitions towards sustainability and flexibility are transforming the approach to use of space.
I hope you're doing well, Julie. Thank you very much for accepting my invitation for the Step Into My Office podcast series.
Absolutely. I'm happy to be here, Olivia.
Today, we'll discuss a bit about CBRE's annual survey that you do, and also where's the office market heading and where does co-working and flex office come into play in the landscape of traditional office.
Great. Things that I'm happy to talk about and I talk about.
I am very glad to hear that. So, how much has hybrid work reshaped demand for traditional office spaces so far? And to what extent do you expect the office market to stabilize in 2025?
Olivia, hybrid work has had a major impact on the office sector. I think that all of us that are professionals in this space understand that. But when I really thought about it, there are a couple metrics that really bring that to life. So if you think about the average size of a lease that's transacted, that today is 25% smaller than it was before the pandemic. At the same time, we often think about space in terms of space per worker from a square footage perspective. And we're at about 146 square feet per worker in the United States today. And that's really all office using employees divided by the amount of occupied space in the US. And that typically is around 161 square feet per worker. So that's down about 9% since the pandemic. And then all that together is really muting leasing activity. So that's the number of square feet that get leased every year is down about 20% below what it was before the pandemic. So that just gives you a few metrics to show you that demand has absolutely been reshaped. However, we do feel that has all plateaued. So you'll hear a lot about a shift happening in the office market today. And although the average size of a lease is smaller today, it has still grown from how small it had gotten really during the depths of the pandemic. Same thing with leasing activity. Although it's still below what it was before the pandemic, it has grown year over year by a little bit more than 4%. And same thing with space per worker. Although it's 9% below what it was before the pandemic, that number has plateaued. It's really not dropping any further, and we don't believe that it's going to drop any further. So we actually see that although we are still in a zone where things look different than they were before the pandemic, they have also plateaued in a space that's allowing us now to get used to, quote unquote, a new normal.
Mm-hmm. And what differences are you noticing in office utilization trends across different regions and industries? And what are the main factors driving those variances?
So I think that's what makes it so hard to talk about the office market today and what's happening in it, is because depending on what industry you're in or what geography you're in within the world or even within the United States, you could be having a very different experience. And so to talk about these metrics with a broad brush or to just have one blanket statement is really difficult in today's market. If you think about regionally in the US, we only have public data to go off of, but what I find interesting is that the markets that are less reliant on public transit are ones that seem to have the highest return rates right now. So that's some of the Texas markets are the ones that get reported on a lot, and they do have higher return rates, at least reported, than what is happening in our larger gateway metro areas that are more heavily public transit related. That being said, New York is one of the transit or cities that are very reliant on public transit that actually has some of the highest return to office rates that are just below what's happening in those really car dependent markets. And the way that I read that is New York is one of our markets that has the densest ratio of people that live and work in it. And that might seem surprising considering we have a lot of major gateway markets, but many of them aren't densely populated with people that live and work in them. New York is obviously a very different story, and as a result has a higher return to office rate. So really that car dependency and how close people live in proximity to where they work really matters in the US in terms of the return to office rates that folks are seeing. Now, globally, I know that there's been a lot of discussion about how maybe Europe doesn't have the same challenges with return to office that we do here in the US, but what we see is that Europe is not back to where they were before the pandemic. The major difference that I see in Europe is that most companies in Europe have subscribed to the same policy, and that policy tends to be that kind of 3 to 4 days a week in the office. Whereas when you look across the US, there is much more diversity in policy, with about 20% of companies that want people in 4 or 5 days a week, about 20% of companies that barely expect people to be in at all, and then the rest that are somewhere in the middle. And so as a result of that kind of homogenous nature of how companies are approaching the hybrid work in Europe, I think it feels that there's a little bit more of a stickiness with people coming back to the office than what we see here in the US. And then obviously in many of the Asia Pacific markets, there is much less dependency on hybrid work. There are many reasons behind that. And as a result, they do see higher return to office rates. But importantly, unless you are really a domestic Asian company, they are still grappling with getting people back to the office as much as they had before the pandemic. So this is really a global phenomenon that's happening right now. It's just that different markets are seeing it to different rates. And then, of course, industries are different. So a lot of the industries like financial services and the legal industry are seeing people come back to the office a little bit more than other industries like tech. And much of that has to do with nothing more than really the policies and the culture of these organizations to date. What I will say is that we do see a little bit of a trend going into 2025 of pushing office attendance a little bit more. And we do expect that will marginally move the needle in the direction of seeing a little bit greater office attendance, especially on those peak days. But I don't think that we're going to see a major change in office attendance in 2025 as a result of some of these policy changes and enforcement changes that we see being discussed a lot in the US.
I wanted to talk to you about the America's Office Occupier Sentiment Survey, which revealed that although attendance policies were widely adopted, enforcement of those policies remain inconsistent. And I wanted to know, how has this disconnect shaped the office sector as we see it today, and how can landlords and organizations be more efficient in bridging the gap between attendance policies and actually enforcement of those policies?
I think that what's happened, as we talked about earlier, is that the office market has shifted because the majority of companies have adopted a hybrid work structure. And as a result of that, they're downsizing because they realized that they didn't need all the space that they had. Now, I think that many organizations today are adjusting to that and realizing in some cases that they actually swung the pendulum too far towards contraction. We're seeing a real sentiment shift across organizations today that are more moderating back to the middle a little bit as a result of a little bit of this combination between enforcement and cultural shifts happen in their organization. Now, what this means is that some people realize that they've given up too much space, so they're taking more space in order to have the space for people to come back to, that they're calling back to the office. Others in their renewal process may still be renewing for less space, but not downsizing quite as much as maybe they would have if this were a couple of years ago. And what we see is that many new companies that perhaps a few years ago may have thought that they didn't need office space at all are actually coming into the market and transacting on space. So as far as landlords bridging the gap, it's really hard. Landlords aren't able to do too much to actually bridge that gap for organizations. However, what we do see that they're doing is implementing more flexibility in their buildings. And instead of having a building stack that's full of long-term leases for 7 to 10 years with tenants not able to have any flexibility in negotiating something different, there's a lot of different structures that landlords are offering now to both accommodate maybe the larger tenant that is trying to manage their space needs better, or the smaller tenant that might not be as committed to signing a 7 to 10 year lease because they really don't know what the future might hold for their growth structure.
And since you mentioned flexibility, what are some strategies that both landlords and occupiers use to integrate flex office solutions into traditional office settings? I've seen a growing trend towards landlords mostly using flexibility in their portfolios. So if you could touch on some of the strategies that they use to integrate flexibility offers in their portfolios.
Absolutely. If we were talking 5 years ago, I would have told you that landlords are testing the flexible office space model by engaging with the third-party operators that we heard so much about back then. And that was really innovative of them because that was something that, although it was growing very fast back then, many landlords were still a little bit hesitant around it. So it was still seen as quite a progressive thing to do. Now, today, what we're seeing is there's a lot more vacancy in the office market, right? Before the pandemic, we were somewhere around 12% office vacancy in the US, and today we're up around 19%. So that's quite a difference, meaning that many landlords have a lot of vacancy in their building that they're able to think about new innovative ways of using that space, especially during a period where overall leasing activity is down. And so what we see is that some of the larger institutional landlords are offering very innovative owner-driven flex space solutions. So in some cases, they're partnering with third-party providers in an outsourced arrangement, or in other cases, they're going at this innovation alone. And some of that may look like on-demand conference facilities, because if you think about it, if the average size of a lease is 25% smaller than it was before the pandemic, that means that there is less space within the leased portfolio of these occupiers to do things like hold meetings in. So a lot of times those large conference facilities that used to be within leased space were the first thing to go because we know they didn't get utilized very often. So some of these landlords are coming in and actually building floors of conference facilities that are modern. They are fully service oriented, meaning that you can get catering and reception services and tech services through them. And they actually can be a revenue stream for these landlords, and tenants themselves are really eager to use them because, again, they don't have this space to use in their own portfolios many times. Some landlords are offering pre-built suites because although the leasing volume is down in the United States, the number of leases is actually up, meaning that there are a lot of smaller tenants transacting. And many times these smaller tenants don't want to have to worry about building out their own spaces. So some landlords are offering pre-built suites that are move-in ready, sometimes even furnished, that have services associated with them, that have much shorter lease terms than your traditional 7 to 10 year lease, but not quite as on demand as that maybe 6 month to 1 year service oriented agreement that might be traditional of co-working. So there's a lot of different innovative solutions that landlords are offering today in order to more so activate their building stack and have a lot of different options that different types of tenants might be engaged with that help them really market their building to a larger swath of customers than may have typically been available to them. So that's what we see many progressive landlords doing. Of course, traditional co-working is still important for a segment of the market. We still see that as being far under 2% of the market today. And is there still room for growth for it? Absolutely. But I think it's important to realize that what we know about being flexible from an office perspective is made up of a lot of different solutions today, not just that on-demand co-working solution.
Yes, you're right. And on the contrary to what you just said about how they're adopting the flex model, what are some of the main barriers preventing the wider adoption of flex office models, and how can these barriers be overcome? How can landlords better cooperate to overcome them, and what are the main challenges when it comes to adopting flexibility in their portfolios?
Yeah, so I think that it really comes down to experience, if I had to really summarize it. And it's because this is all new, right? Even before the pandemic, when we were talking about those traditional co-working operators, even though that had been a decade-long process of that growing and becoming important in the market, it was still a small segment of the market, and there still wasn't a lot of experience around it. Now we've put that on steroids, and we have all sorts of different options for flexibility that landlords can offer. And it is experience, I think, that's stopping some landlords from doing it more, and honestly, occupiers from knowing how to use it. From a landlord perspective, although the ones that we've talked to that have been very progressive about doing it actually tout it as being an additional revenue stream for their building that over time is going to actually help the value of their building. But in reality, that's a very small segment of the market that feel comfortable doing that and feel that they're building the experience to do that. Most of them don't, and they still value buildings and underwrite buildings in very traditional methods that are rooted in long-term leases. And many of the lenders and shareholders of these buildings feel the same way. And until we get more experience to be able to prove out the value of flexibility in buildings, it is going to be a barrier to adoption. Same thing with occupiers. Occupiers have gotten very sophisticated in the way that they look at space and analyze space and traditionally lease space. However, trying to figure out how to create flexible lease structures within the confines of all of these different options that are available to them is difficult, because the reality is different landlords offer different options, and there isn't a lot of experience yet in how that all can be rolled together in lease structures that make sense. And so I really think that these barriers to adoption come down to experience at this point. But over time, I think that experience will be had, and we will see success cases, and that will lead to more of this being done, and therefore more experience, which will make the whole thing easier.
I want to know one more thing about flex office as part of the traditional office sector. How do you see the role of flex office evolving for companies that are expanding versus those downsizing?
From an expansion perspective, I think that many occupiers before the pandemic were taking more space than they needed and paying for vacant space because the market was so tight, it was so competitive in many cases that and the economy was doing well, and they knew they were going to have more headcount, that they would have rather hedged their bets and paid for space they didn't need versus not have the space that they wanted when they needed it. And I think that what now Flex Office is doing is allowing companies that are expanding to be a little bit more realistic about their near-term goals, but yet still build in a safety net for expansion when they need it. Now, similarly, for those that are downsizing, I think that those that are thinking about downsizing in many cases are able to perhaps be a little bit more aggressive with that downsizing. Because although we do see a plateauing in the amount of space or lack of space that people are taking, the reality is there is still more of a contraction mentality, especially across large companies, than there is expansion. And I think that many of those that are downsizing today are able to say, if I do need the space, or if I have overflow space a few times a year or once a quarter, because maybe I have executives that come visit the office or I have consultants that I invite in, I don't necessarily have to build that space into my lease space. I can ask the landlord if there is flexible space that these people can use for the few times a year that they come, and therefore I can downsize more. So I think that depending on which angle you're taking, you have space that you can build in as a safety valve for expansion purposes, or you have space that you can build in for a safety valve for overflow purposes if you're scared you're downsizing too much. So in both cases, you have an evolution of the way that you're looking at space, whether you're expanding or downsizing.
And considering all these dynamics in the sector, including the adoption of flexibility, including the shift to hybrid work, and how leases and renewals are changing in the space, how do owners now define success across their office or flex office portfolios?
So I think that success is still defined by how well utilized the space is, because the whole point of spaces and places are for people to come together and gather in them. And so the ultimate definition of success is my space being used, because vacant space equals, the lack of success in that space. Now, for landlords, that space utilization really used to have to do with how much of the space is leased up. But in today's market, I think that although that is a metric, it isn't the only metric. Landlords also really need to pay attention to how much people are visiting their buildings and how often they're utilizing spaces, because it could give them a clue into future years as leases do come up to roll, whether or not the tenants in the building are actually utilizing their space to the capacity that it could be. And they can feel more secure if they know that people are filtering in and out of their building at a good rate on a daily basis. And that has to do with how activated their building is. How are the public spaces being used? How are the retail spaces being used? So again, I think the bellwether for success used to be my office is 90% leased up, and so therefore it's successful and I can check that box. And today it goes a step further than that. And it's really, does my building feel activated? And is it being used to a great extent? Because that is going to give me a clue into the future success of my building also. And what some landlords are doing to actually help drive that opportunity for success is they are building spaces that can be activated more. So again, instead of just having those chunks of spaces around your building that are leased up for 7 to 10 years and maybe a coffee shop on the ground floor, there are a lot more activated amenities and services that tenants can engage with that are making them stickier with the building. And that might be those shared meeting spaces that we talked about earlier. It might be really amazing, not only fitness centers, but in some cases it could be pickleball courts. I saw one building owner building into their new building. And it could be really great activated public spaces that people can use to have meetings and that make the building feel more activated. So again, it's not just about those long-term leases anymore. In some ways, landlords are becoming more hospitality driven, where they're trying to make their building overall more attractive at a holistic level for the tenants that use them and even the public that can come in and use some of these spaces that can be activated on a more on-demand basis.
I was about to also say that I've spoken with a lot of landlords that are now more hospitality driven, and they come up with these amazing amenities and very interesting amenities to make the people who are in the office feel more comfortable and feel healthier.
Yes. Yep. And I think it's important for the listener to understand also that we're not expecting that every single building in every single city is going to be highly amenitized and activated. However, there is a market for it that is growing. And the way that we look at these buildings at CBRE is we actually study what we call prime stock, which tends to be this activated, hospitality driven space. And it only makes up about 10% of the market today. And that's the end of the market that has had positive net absorption straight through the pandemic, and that has much lower vacancy than the headline vacancy in the market. And we predict that within the next couple of years, because of the lack of new construction that's coming out of the ground today that would typically be prime, that we are going to be out of this type of space and it's going to become even more competitive than it is today. And what that leads you to say is that there needs to be that next tier of building that gets brought up to that level of prime, because many of these markets are going to be screaming for it within the next couple of years. But that being said, there is a commodity tranche of space in cities that also is highly attractive to those tenants that are really looking for space that is a better value for them, and that might not be looking to pay top dollar for space in their market, but might want to be in a really great submarket.
And since we touched a bit on trends, I also wanted to talk to you about the wider adoption of technology. Since your research revealed that 40% of companies are deploying advanced technologies to automate workflow, what are some innovative uses of technology in corporate real estate that you find most promising?
I think that corporate real estate executives are focused on this area quite a bit. However, I think that there's an element of a skill base and resources that are a challenge in really driving forward advanced adoption of technology in a real way right now. That being said, I think that data analytics and AI combined are going to be what moves the needle the most. We talked about automating workflows, and I think that a lot of what is the low-hanging fruit that can be automated to free people's time up for more value-added things is being done. And what that means is that there's a lot more strategic work that can get done. But the way that you do that strategic work and set yourself up for success is being able to real-time analyze information in a way that helps you to push the needle forward. So some ways that I can think about doing that I think are most important in today's world is, number one, building utilization. However we get building utilization data, whether it be through badge swipes or through sensor data, which isn't super popular at the moment, or even through reservation data, right? I think that taking that data and being able to automate getting it, automate analyzing it, and even automate getting insights through it, and then being able to strategically take what you learn from that data and automated insights and do something strategically with it in the organization to make your spaces and places better and more attractive and more effective for the people that use it is extremely critical today. Another way that I see this at use is through the building systems data. Many systems around the buildings are connected today, and they're able to feed out a lot of this real data and insight, which allows for more sustainable building operations in the long term. And especially many large companies have net zero goals that are coming up upon them very quickly. And so I think that those are two ways that this sort of combination of data and analytics and AI are coming together to really catapult those two areas forward within the next couple of years.
You briefly mentioned net zero buildings. I wanted to discuss a bit about other trends that are shaping the office/flex office market in terms of management, amenities, maybe workplace design, and either other sustainability features that you've noticed.
So I think that we touched a bit upon the amenities and what is important for buildings to have. As far as, what actual tenants are building into their leased space for amenities, that becomes a really interesting question, because what we are increasingly talking to tenants about is understanding A, what's in your neighborhood that's already offered, B, what is in your building now that's offered, especially if you're in one of these buildings that is more activated, and then figuring out what needs to be built into your office space that those two areas are not satisfying. So instead of saying we have to offer food and beverage within the office, or we have to offer health and fitness, first really understand what is in your existing building and in your neighborhood before worrying about that. Because ultimately, what's really important that the building and the neighborhood cannot satisfy for is creating an actual workspace design that can be effective for the people that use it. And yes, amenities go into that, but also the way that spaces are designed and built today matter a lot, because we are far beyond just having offices and cubicles and maybe some conference rooms sprinkled around with some pantry areas on the corners of the building. What workplace design is really moving towards right now is at a baseline activity-based workplace, which is often shared in nature, less of an assigned environment, but that does not mean that privacy cannot be attained in these environments. They are environments that can be made up of dozens of workspaces that range from private focused areas to work, private areas to have meetings, and then social areas and everything in between, depending on how people work. And so what we see organizations focusing on a lot today is understanding, how do people work in this organization, and how do I build spaces that best serve how they work? And then how do I analyze how they use those spaces real time so that I can change them as I need to make them continually effective for my people? So that's what I see as being the trend now for corporate occupiers, for sure.
Um, I'll move on to the last question, and I want to know, how do you expect the office and flex office sectors to perform in 2025, and what are some of your predictions for these sectors?
Sure. From an office sector perspective, at a holistic level, we've spent much of the last 4 to 5 years in a down cycle, meaning that vacancy was rising, rents have been falling, capital values have been challenged. And we feel that 2025 is a period of stabilization. I'm very careful not to say a period of full-blown recovery, because I still think that it is obviously going to be a tenant's market. We are still going to have historically high vacancy rates. However, we say stabilization because we do anticipate that leasing activity and tenant demand will continue to increase. And at the same time that's happening, the new construction that is being delivered to the office market is 75% below what it was before the pandemic. So we don't have a lot of new space that is going to be replenishing the space that is going to be taken up by the increased tenant demand. By the end of 2025, that should start to lead to a vacancy rate that is on the downward trajectory again, meaning that it's starting to decline and return back to healthier levels. And at the same time as all that's happening, the office stock that is simply not viable as office anymore going forward will slowly get taken out of the system. I say slowly because it is not easy to do. Although it's very easy to talk about conversion and demolition, it takes time and expertise and capital to do that. But we do see a slight uptick in that. And over time, we do believe that will help the office market return to its full health also. As far as the flex office market, I think that lives within the traditional office market, and we do see that there is continued demand for that space. However, where it shakes out in terms of the type of flexibility that becomes the most popular, that is an area of the market that we are trying to uncover, because it really isn't all that transparent. What is transparent about our markets is what gets leased. However, when you start to talk about management agreements and service agreements and outsourced agreements and pre-built office suites, it becomes a really opaque area to analyze and to understand. But we do see that the need for more flexibility exists with tenants today. What that flexibility looks like, whether, as you noted before, you're a client that is expanding a lot or looking to downsize, or you're a small tenant or a large tenant, or you're in a suburban market or an urban market, there are different flexibility solutions for all of those. And landlords and the third-party operators alike are doing what they can to satisfy that. But we are still very much in a phase of that experimentation and learning and experience building, and we will be for a matter of years.
Thank you. And thank you very much for the insights you've offered us today for this podcast episode. It was really nice talking to you.
It was very nice to talk to you also, Olivia.
Thank you for stepping into our office. Stay tuned for the next episode and feel free to rate this one if you've enjoyed it. For more commercial news, trend stories, and podcast episodes, visit commercialsearch.com/news. Moreover, don't hesitate to join CPE's Executive Council. Every month, we discuss the latest trends and topics with leading experts in the field, and your input could be extremely helpful. To join, please send an email to jessica.fiur@cpe-mhn.com. Happy holidays and stay safe.